Guys, can y'all hear me okay? Yeah. Everybody okay? Thank you for letting me get up in front of you and run my mouth a little bit this morning. It's always a pleasure to hang out with you guys and talk about World War I airplanes, and it's also an honor to get up here to be asked to speak to you, because as far as I'm concerned, I come here to hear you guys. I don't come here to talk, so I appreciate being given the opportunity to get up here and do this. Mike asked me a couple of months ago if I'd be willing to do a presentation on the artwork of the Lafayette Escadrille. I assumed he meant my artwork. I've done a few. I guess you can say that great subjects inspire artwork. I've probably done more paintings involving the Lafayette Escadrille than any other single unit of the Great War. Like I said, great subjects inspire artwork. But just to make sure that I'm all-inclusive here, let me start the presentation by featuring a few other pieces by other artists who have come before me. We all know this one, of course, by the great Henri Faré, the portrait of Bill Thaw. This one was hanging out in the gallery, I believe, last time we were here. Just a beautiful, beautiful work, as is all of his work. First American Ace by my friend Roy Grinnell, depicting one of Blueberry's victories over Roland C-2. I don't know the names of these next two pieces, but they're by a French artist by the name of Paul Engel. I think he created these probably back in the 70s or 80s. This seems to be the death of the final flight of Victor Chapman, is my interpretation. And I don't know the specific event here, but obviously it is Lafayette Escadrille related, because it's got the Seminole Indian head on it. Now, a lot of you were probably present for my presentation in Orlando a few years ago, and because of that, I obviously don't want to give you a duplicate presentation if you've already heard that material. Most of you by now are roughly familiar with my workflow and the step-by-step process by which I create a painting. So what I'd like to do with this is talk about the different Lafayette Escadrille themed works that I've created, give you some history behind them, try to give you an idea of how the different aspects of my workflow played a part in their creation. This presentation may not be quite as academic as the one I gave in Orlando, but it's probably a good thing for those of you who are like me and may not have had sufficient coffee yet. Just a random thought, I was out in South Dakota a few weeks ago and I was given an Indian name. That's Russ Needs Coffee. What I want to do is give you a better insight into the background of each painting, a few of my thoughts that went into them, my decision-making process, and how other factors influence the look of a painting. I'm going to talk about these in chronological order, so as we go through, you should be able to get an idea of how my style has evolved over the years, for better or for worse. Now, you guys know that I use two categories to describe my paintings. The first being aircraft portraits, in which the purpose of the painting is simply to highlight the most attractive lines or shapes or angles of an aircraft. If there's a particular location involved with an aircraft, sometimes I'll indicate that in the background as a way of putting the aircraft in its natural setting. These pieces tend to be a little bit easier in that I have more possibilities as to what lines and angles and elements that I can put in the painting. The second type of painting that I do is a historical narrative, in which I'm telling a specific story or trying to depict a specific event. These pieces tend to be a little more difficult because when you're depicting a subject that's been well documented, oftentimes the facts surrounding the subject can limit the amount of creativity you can apply to a scene, especially when you're painting old, well-documented subjects like this. Sometimes you're limited by the facts in front of you, I find that, I may have a great idea for a painting, but no, I can't do that because that won't tell the story adequately. Now, there are several considerations involved with creating aviation art that make it particularly challenging in comparison to other subjects. For example, direct access to your subject is often hard to come by. Oftentimes, the only examples available to you are in dark museums with limited access and behind barriers, and you can't really get up to them and see them up close. And when you do come across an example that's airworthy, think about this. Unless you're doing a ground scene, it's impossible to draw or paint your subject from life at altitude. Now, I rarely ever follow the same exact workflow with each painting. Each painting tends to be its own entity and requires its own approach in terms of concept and execution. But as you'll see, for the most part, I do follow the same general workflow. So to get started, let's do these in chronological order. The first piece that I ever created was Lafayette Escadrille theme, was Hostile Sky. It was a commission by our long-lost friend, Terry Phillips. Taz called me up and said, I want to commission a painting of the final flight of Victor Chapman, the first American airman to lose his life in aerial combat. Now, a little backstory here. Victor Chapman, of course, was born in New York City in April of 1890. He had plans to attend the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris to become an architect, but of course a declaration of war in August of 1914 spoiled those plans. However, by September, he had already enlisted in the French Foreign Legion. And of course, here he is, back row center, with some of his fellow legionnaires. Edward Genet and William Dugan, here's the pointer here, are seen on the front row on the right, center and the right. And on either side of Chapman, right there and there, are Marius Rokel, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Eugene Bullard, both future Lafayette Escadrille, or Lafayette Flying Corps pilots.
Easier, John.
Now, Chapman survived for 11 months with the Foreign Legion before news reached him in August of 1915 that he was to be transferred to VB-108, a Lausanne unit, where he served as a gunner and a bombardier. It was with this unit that he subsequently met Elliot Cowden and Norman Prince, who were serving in the same unit. And it was through them that Victor found out about the efforts to form an American escadrille. Victor applied for pilot training, and with the help of Norman Prince, he was accepted to the School of Military Aviation at Avord in September of 1915. And it was at the aviation school that he met Kiffin, Rockwell, and Bert Hall. And of course, it was through these numerous contacts that he was inevitably assigned to the newly formed Lafayette Escadrille. And here he is with some of his new squadron mates, McConnell, Rockwell, Fano, Prince. Now, according to Chapman's father, this was the high point of his life. This was the opportunity to become the knight errant that he had always dreamed of being. He quickly gained a reputation as an aggressive pilot. For example, on June 17th, Chapman was on patrol with some of his other squadron mates, and they were on the flying along the Meuse, and he spotted some Germans on the other side, and he disobeyed a direct order from Thaw and crossed the Meuse and attacked. He barely escaped with his life. Got a bullet through the back of his Newport, which grazed his scalp. And I was commenting, this photo is also hanging in the World War I gallery out here, and I was commenting to Jim Wilberg yesterday. I find it ironic that he's standing there smiling when, one, he just barely almost got himself killed, and two, he probably just got his ass chewed out for disobeying orders. Maybe that's a grimace, maybe it's not a smile, but whatever. Here he is right after his incident. Now, of course, we all know the story. Chapman was flying his Newport 16 on June 23rd on a personal errand to deliver a crate of oranges to Clyde Balsley. He had followed Loufberry and Prince and Thaw up on patrol, and not being able to ignore a scrap, he got himself tangled up with 4 Germans over Douaumont and never made it home. French fireman crew later reported seeing a lone Newport going down in the same area. Now, of course, one of the first steps in creating a painting is to create thumbnail sketches, where you're basically just throwing out ideas. It's like throwing spaghetti against a wall and see what'll stick, see what's going to work. This is a good scan from my old sketchbook where I was working out the ideas for this piece. This painting is a good example of a historical narrative that I spoke of. With a painting like this, what I first have to do is decide exactly which moment to portray. I have to ask myself, what's the climax of the story? When does the drama reach its peak? And decide what composition best expresses that. Now, obviously, I don't spend a lot of time on my sketches trying to get the lines and proportions right, because here, at this stage, I'm just trying to work quickly. What I'm trying to do is come up with an abstract pattern, basically. In order for a composition to work, you may not know this, but even with representational art, the underlying abstract pattern has to be strong, because when you see a painting from across a room, your brain interprets this abstract pattern before your eyes can ever take in and interpret the details. It's that abstract pattern that really supports a piece. This is true even with representational artwork. If the abstract pattern is weak, the painting won't hold together. Now, I also often try to create a composition that has large shapes in it, because again, large shapes read well from across a room. And if you can catch a viewer from across a room and pull them over to see your painting, that's a strong piece right there. Now, originally, we had planned to depict Chapman's Newport as a cream-colored Newport, just the way he had described it in letters home to his father. But somewhere along the process, Taz came across a blurb indicating that just a few days prior to his death, Chapman's Newport had been painted light blue. Now, I've seen that reference. I couldn't put my finger back on it while I was putting together this presentation, but I do know that John, in his Osprey book, describes it as pale gray. So light blue, pale gray. Sometimes there's a fine line there to differentiate the two. Now, this is the color study for the piece. Once I get compositions worked out to my liking and I know where everything's going to go, oftentimes I'll create a color study. Now, the idea of a color study means different things to different artists. Some people, it's just a thumbnail sketch in color. My color studies tend to be a little more involved, tend to be a little more detailed than your average color study. Mine are basically small versions of the big painting. This is a test drive, is basically what it is. I'm trying to work out all the problems, see where I'm going to run into issues in the composition before I get to the larger painting, because it's much more difficult to make changes to a larger painting than it is to the smaller color study. This can be a throwaway piece if I want it to be. I can experiment with this. Now, you'll notice here that my color palette is not true to nature. The sky is yellow. I leaned heavily on yellow in this one because psychologically yellow is an unsettling color, and I was trying to give a sense of tension here. I was trying to make the viewer a little bit unsettled because this is not a happy moment. You know, Victor Chapman's not going home. Fortunately, the yellow sky held together. It held up, and the painting worked out. There's the final piece, Hostile Sky. In the end, it's a simple composition with large shapes that I mentioned, and generally speaking, it's hard to go wrong with that formula. This painting won an Award of Merit in the 2005 ASAA exhibition. Now the next piece in line, Mark of Distinction. Mark of Distinction was the first of several works I've created over the past few years which feature Bill Thaw. All were commissioned by a relative of Thaw who was supposed to be here this weekend, but unfortunately he came down ill and had to cancel. Now, of course, Bill Thaw was one of the outstanding members of the Escadrille. Bill Thaw was born in 1893 in Pittsburgh. He enrolled at Yale at the age of 18, but left there his sophomore year to pursue a career in aviation. He learned to fly at the Curtis School of Aviation in Hammondsport, New York, and where he purchased a Curtis Hydro, which he subsequently operated out of Newport, Rhode Island. That's kind of a neat shot right there. Thaw controls his Hydro. Now, prior to serving with the Escadrille, Bill Thaw served as a gunner and observer with Escadrille D6, and then later with Escadrille C-42. Now, I'm going to talk more about his time with C-42 towards the end of the presentation, but right now let's focus on the Escadrille. As a result of his exemplary service with the previous units, Thaw was the only pilot to report to the Escadrille upon its creation as a commissioned French officer, and he remained the highest ranking pilot throughout the squadron's existence. Now, in mid-October of 1916, the Escadrille moved to its new base at Cashy, and dismal was the best way to describe the conditions at Cashy. It sounds kind of like Dayton, Ohio right now. McConnell described it as a sea of mud. However, dismal doesn't necessarily make for great painting. It tends to mute colors and kill the light a little bit, so I decided, this photo right here is a good example to show that, yeah, they did have a few sunny days, so okay, that's what I'm going to go with. I'm going to depict the sunny day because that'll pop the colors out a little bit more.
You can still see the mud, though.
You can still, exactly, you can still see the mud. Here's a good example showing one of the Newport 17s with the Seminole Indian head on it. What the client wanted to do was he wanted to commission a painting showing his relative Bill Thaw presenting the Seminole Indian head to Thaw. Dennis Gordon writes that after their arrival at Cashy in mid-October of 1916, Bill Thaw suggested that the unit adopt the Seminole Indian head logo used on the Savage ammunition boxes as their own. Corporal Suchet, squadron mechanic, was asked to adapt the image for the Newport fuselages. And prior to this, the only markings carried on the Newports were the national insignia, the rudder stripes, and any personal insignia that the pilots might use. Now, obviously, the very nature of this painting, Thaw presenting the Indian head to Thaw, that's going to be a figurative work. So let me talk about figures for just a minute. From a creative point of view, placing figures in a painting makes a painting exponentially more difficult, especially when it's multiple figures. On one hand, introducing the human element into a painting gives the viewer a psychological bridge by which they can better relate to a painting. When figures are involved, the human eye it naturally gravitates towards the figure because we always want to know, what's that person doing? What are they talking about? What's going on there? We naturally relate to people. Simply put, we like to people watch, right? It goes back to that very nature. The human figure is always interesting. Now, this is especially true when there's an interaction between two figures, as it creates a natural point of interest. And when you introduce a figure into a painting, you open up a whole new set of considerations. First of all, the language of gesture and expression. A lot of times, stage actors will tell you that when they're trying to convey an emotion on stage, it helps to overact just a little bit to get the point across. The same is true in a painting. Sometimes when you're trying to convey an idea or an expression, it helps to exaggerate the figure's expression or gesture just a little bit to get the idea across. You also have to consider the double purpose of figures as they're used both as a compositional element and to tell a story. And finally, small nuances in the placement or a gesture of a figure can make or break a painting. Here's a good example of that. On the left here, is this working? Yeah. On the left here, this was the original placement of Thaw and Thaw as they were going to be relative to each other in the painting. Now, there's a few problems with this. First of all, there's a disconnect between the two figures. Thaw is looking across the painting. Thaw is looking away from us. All we see is the back of his ear. I decided that it would be stronger if I actually overlapped the two. What this does, first of all, is it creates one visual mass. It reads as one visual mass rather than two. You have a better sense of interaction between the two figures. Putting them closer also allowed me to rotate Thaw's head slightly more towards us, so that now not only is he talking to Thaw, but he's also, in a sense, kind of talking to the viewer too. So you get the viewer involved. He's talking to you as you look at the painting. I also decided that if I turned Thaw's head so that he's would be looking at the Indian head rather than at Thaw, that allows us to see more of his profile and less of his left ear there. It's little things like that that really make or break a painting. Now, figures can give a composition both an organic flow and a sense of life, but figures have to be convincing. The smallest error in a figure stands out like a spotlight. Not everybody, believe it or not, can spot a perspective or proportion problem with an airplane, but we all of us know what a human figure is supposed to look like. Our brains are finely attuned to that, and if there's anything wrong with the figure, the viewer's going to immediately know it. Now, the client had an additional request for this painting. In addition to the Indian head logo theme, he wanted to show another icon of the Lafayette Escadrille, that being whiskey. More specifically, he asked to show whiskey chewing on a paintbrush. Now, of course, whiskey was acquired in September of 1916 when several of the Escadrille pilots, including Thaw, were in Paris. They saw an ad for a lion cub that had been placed by a Brazilian dentist, and they decided, hey, we need a lion cub. You know, who wouldn't? Who wouldn't say that? But given my lack of familiarity with lion anatomy, that was going to be a little bit of a problem. So how do you paint a convincing lion when you only have a basic idea of lion anatomy and you don't have an actual subject to draw from? Well, thank goodness for the internet, right? You know, I did a Google search of a whole bunch of lion cub images, and fortunately I found two that I could kind of morph together into one. And the line up here, he's even chewing on something, so that made it that much easier. All I had to do was replace that with a paintbrush. Now here's the color study for the painting. Now, ironically, a few years ago I had a computer crash on me that took down several of my images, this being one of them. So as I was putting this presentation together, I had to go on the internet and steal one of my own images altogether. This is a good example of a color study where I'm trying to be as critical as possible and make any last-minute adjustments prior to going to the big canvas. This study's good, but it's a good example of where I've still got some minor issues to work out. For example, the composition, it needed some changes before I went to the big piece. Most notably, this hanger line right behind Thaw's head. That wasn't working. I decided that the hanger should be moved farther to the right so that that line didn't come right behind his head. His head would pop out a little more if it were against the trees there. Secondly, he needed to be moved a little more to his right so that his hand extended down into the Indian head a little more. That would strengthen that connection there between the two, and it would also strengthen this line that directs your eye up to his head. The figures of Thaw and Biennial are also a little bit out of proportion, or out of perspective, rather. They needed to be a little bit bigger so that they appear a little closer to the viewer. The client commented that the sky was a little bit ominous looking, so we wanted that lightened up a little bit. And so once all those changes were made, that's the final piece. You can see I cropped a little bit off the sky there too. And I'll go back so you can see the comparison. That's the final painting of Mark of Distinction. Now, at this point, I have to point out something. As I was working on this presentation, I came across an image that I wanted to use in the book. I'd never seen this before, and as I was downloading this into the presentation, I just showed this a minute ago, I looked at this image and I thought, wait a minute, if I flip this image, some of you see this already, if I flip this image horizontally, holy cow, I swear to you, that was coincidental. I had not seen this photo before, but actually, to be honest, I think it's kind of neat that my painting reflected a photo that had already been taken of the Escadrille at Kashif. Now the next painting in line, 4 down for Thaw. There's not a lot of rich historical background on this one. I think originally we had planned to depict Thaw's 5th victory, his ace-making victory, but unfortunately when we did a little research on that, both his 5th confirmed and unconfirmed victories are simply listed as scouts, and that's not a whole lot to go by. Well, it turns out my client has an affinity not only for 2-seaters, but of types that are less depicted in artwork. So we just bumped back one and looked at Thaw's 4th victory, and it turns out Norman Franks listed that as a rumpler. And my client said, let's go with a rumpler. So we start working out compositions for this. Fortunately, in a situation like this where you still don't have much to go on, it allows me a lot of latitude. I can be as creative as I want. This could be anything we want it to be as long as it shows Thaw's spad and a rumper going down in the background. Alan Tolley was gracious enough to provide me with the markings for this piece. I thought these were a great set of markings. Thaw's ubiquitous T that's on his machines. Now let me stop the presentation for a minute and talk to you about how I draw an airplane. Some of you are already familiar with this. Regardless of whether I'm working on a ground scene or an aerial scene, one of the first things, once I put a composition together, one of the first things I have to do is create an accurate perspective drawing of an airplane. Now there are 2 types of perspective. There's linear perspective and there's atmospheric perspective. In this case, I'm talking about linear perspective. I don't draw from models just because of the problems that are inherent with drawing from models. Models can be warped, they can be inaccurate. There's a whole wide range of problems when you try to draw directly from a model. I also don't draw directly from photos because, one, with a photo, I'm limited to the view that the photographer's given me, and also with a photo, the focal range of the lens oftentimes doesn't match the viewing distance necessary for painting, and as a result, an airplane that's drawn from a photo often looks distorted or out of perspective because of the difference there. A lot of times I can walk up to a painting and I can tell you the ones that are drawn from a photo because they don't look right. Now, what I do is I create isometric drawings, which basically allow me to select a fixed viewpoint and create an accurate three-dimensional view based on that point. Now, isometric drawing is familiar to a lot of engineers and architects. This is kind of old school stuff, pre-CAD. But it's basically an artistic tool for establishing linear perspective in a two-dimensional space. It's based on Euclidean geometry. It's been around since the Renaissance. Artists such as Masaccio, Brunelleschi, Alberti, Paolo Uccello, and most notably Leonardo da Vinci experimented with this scientific approach to perspective. In later centuries, it was developed even further with the advent of 2- and 3-point perspective. In the 1880s, the American artist Thomas Aiken's pen was probably the definitive manuscript on the subject, and the methods that he described in his book are still relevant for contemporary representational artwork today. Now, there are several approaches to isometric drawing. The approach I use is called projective geometry. It simulates the sight-size method of drawing where the subject is drawn at the same size of the object as it is viewed. The only difference is with projective geometry, the subject is theoretical, whereas with sight-size drawing, the subject is actual. Now, I think I've expressed to some of you before that SPADs are actually kind of a pain to create perspective drawings for. They have a lot of little irregularities, a lot of little bumps and shapes and pipes and fittings and things that come off of them. The fuselage is a really strange shape when you look at the cross-section. It's not clean. So what I usually do with an aircraft like this is I'll start with the lines that I know to be long and straight and true, such as the leading edge of the wing, leading edge of the wings, maybe the axle, the longitudinal axis, the hinge joints, the ailerons, the rudder, the elevators. I'll start with those, get those laid in, and then I'll start building around them. Once that's done, oftentimes I'll create a pencil study of the aircraft. Now, sometimes I'll do this as part of the entire composition. Sometimes I'll do it as a standalone drawing. As you see here, there's the rumpler we decided to use for the painting. I think I might have just kind of made very general markings for this rumpler. And there's the final painting. Now, as you can see here again, this was kind of an experiment in terms of the color palette. I was experimenting with these really intense warm tones. You don't see really an orange sky like this. What I was trying to do was get a sense of heat and action here and create some tension. Now, you'll notice also there's another airplane up here. Once again, as I said, the client has an affinity for two-seaters and types that are less depicted in artwork, and he wanted to see a second airplane. He wanted to see another two-seater, and he wanted to see a different type. So, okay, we'll play with that. That'll allow me to observe the rule of 3. There's a rule in artwork that odd numbers are more interesting than even numbers, and in that, 3 is generally accepted as the most interesting number of elements in a painting. So we threw an albatross C type in there just to kind of round out that composition and make the client happy. Now, the next painting in the series, you guys saw this in the hospitality suite the other night. This is a good example that inspiration can come from many different places. Sometimes the cart precedes the horse. Sometimes you're flying out of Charlotte, North Carolina at 7 a.m. and you look back over your shoulder and you see this and you think, I have got to paint that. So in this case, the background actually preceded the subject. This is a good example of a large aircraft portrait painting. This isn't about historical narration. There's no story here. The purpose of this painting would basically be to nail the emotional accuracy of this piece. This is about putting the viewer in the air with 3 of the Lafayette Escadrille's finest during a rare moment of peace over the front. It wasn't a commissioned piece. This was one of my own indulgences. So pretty much everything in the painting was going to be up to me. I knew right away I wanted to depict Lufberry because I'm fascinated by Lufberry. At some point I'm going to do more artwork on him when I get some time. So here's Lufberry in Thaws, Newport. I think this is credited as being Thaws, but this is a machine that's often associated with Lufberry, so I decided I was going to use this one as my main subject. Secondary aircraft would be Thaws, because at this point I was starting to get pretty familiar with Thaw, and to be honest with you, I had a little hope that maybe the guy who commissioned these other 2 might be interested in buying this painting. There's a little bit of that in there, but This was a neat aircraft just because it had a nice little cursive T on it, and I wanted to include that. And finally, the third aircraft I decided to include in the painting would be Dudley Hills. Now, I'll be honest with you, I don't remember exactly why I chose Dudley Hills, but my thinking is that I was probably just trying to find a third aircraft that was contemporary with those two during the time in the Escadrille. Now, I'll say that of all the World War I aircraft that you can do a perspective drawing for, the early Newports are probably the easiest. They are just nice, simple, clean airplanes, simple shapes, simple lines. I can knock one of these out in probably a day. Newports are just really easy. I love drawing Newports. You guys are probably also aware that even though I don't draw from models, I do use them as lighting reference. Oftentimes I'll go outside, I'll at least take a photo of the plane. If I have time, sometimes what I'll do is create a plein air study of a model in order to really accurately capture the colors and the values. And the resulting painting here by the dawn's early light. This one was awarded the Aviation Week and Space Technology Best of the Best award in the 2010 ASAA exhibition. This one has been a popular image for me. And the final painting in the series, Limping Home. That's not a good stand, it's kind of rasterized, but Limping Home depicts Bill Thaw nursing his crippled Cadrone G4 back to the aerodrome, C-42's aerodrome. Now, as I told you a moment ago, prior to serving with the Lafayette Escadrille, Bill Thaw served as a gunner and observer with Escadrille D6 and then with the newly created Escadrille C-42 from March 1915 to January 1916. Now, according to Steve Sutterby, I know you're out here, Steve helped us a little bit with this piece. Escadrille 42 was created as C-42 on March 22nd, 1915, and on that date, it was equipped with Cadrone G4s. And you can see that's the squadron's logo down here in the bottom left. C-42 was commanded by none other than George Thaw. During his time with C-42, Thaw was twice cited and promoted to sous-lieutenant. He was the first American to ever receive that honor. There's a neat shot of Thaw flying at the controls of a G4. In his citations, it's mentioned that on 2 different occasions he continued with his observational duties despite his aircraft having received significant damage. One of his citations reads as follows: "He always gives proof of the best qualities of bravery and coolness under fire. On 2 occasions in the course of observation missions, his plane was violently shelled and hit by shell fragments causing significant damage. Nevertheless, he continued to observe the enemy positions and only returned once he had completely accomplished his mission." Well, that's what the client wanted to go with. He wanted to show the badly damaged Cadrone limping back to its aerodrome, to C-42's aerodrome. So, of course, we start with sketches. Again, these are really quick little jobs. You can see the proportions of my Cadrone are a little bit stunted in that first one. But we kicked around several ideas: a rear view, front view, cropped in rear view. He's coming in over the hangars here. A low angle front view where you see the bottom of the plane, cropped in. We actually ended up going back with this one. Now, this piece, by very nature, the client wanted to see a low angle view. He wanted to be coming in right over the treetops. So by its very nature, this is going to be a complicated piece because, 1, the Cadrone is a very complicated airplane visually. And 2, when you get a low angle shot like this and you start having to include trees and farms and cows and buildings, it just makes it visually more complicated. So I knew right away this is going to be a piece about controlling chaos, really, more than anything. Once I got everything worked out, I wanted to get a good value plan, a value map for the painting. You can see here, this is on tone paper where I'm working out the highlights, the darks, and letting the tone paper be the mid-tone, basically. Now, prior to working on this painting, my knowledge of Cadrone anatomy wasn't quite as extensive as it is with some other World War I types. Not a problem, because fortunately I know where there's an intact Cadrone G4, and I happen to know a guy who knows a guy who has a cousin whose brother's wife's uncle works at the Air and Space Museum. His name is Carl Bobrow. Carl pointed me down the correct avenues so that I was able to submit a formal request to the powers that be to get up close access to their Cadrones. So Early one morning, Carl and John Barrett and I went out to the Udvar Hazy and spent several hours crawling around this machine and a few others, and I got a whole lot of really juicy shots of their Escadrille, inside and out.
Wait, I don't remember that.
John does. John, I won't
That was
tell.
when you were breaking out for coffee.
Yeah. Now, remember that I said that early Newports were among the easiest airplanes to do perspective drawings for? Well, I can honestly say that the Cadron G4 is the most god-awful thing I have ever had to create a perspective drawing for. That is just wow, there's so many little appendages and parts and little small things coming off here and there, and the undercarriage is really complex, and it's just an odd shape. I thought the FE2 was a hard plane to rig. This thing has got rigging that I don't even know where these things, the wires ended up. There's a wire here and I don't know where it's going. But that being said, I actually, as you can imagine, felt a pretty good sense of accomplishment once this was done. I think this took me 3 days to complete. Here's the color study for the painting. It's pretty good. My only nit here was the colors were a little bit too saturated. I decided to take them down a little bit. Moving on to the big painting, this is what's called a grisé layer. Oftentimes when I've got a complex composition like this, before I start adding color, what I'll do is I'll block in values using a combination of either raw umber or burnt umber and white. And what that does is that helps me to establish these values so that when I go in and start putting in color, all I have to worry about is color. I don't have to worry about how dark it is or how light it is, because I've already got that worked out here. And the final image, Limping Home. It was completed this year. The client took delivery of it just a few months ago. Depicts Thaw bringing his injured or damaged Cadron G4 back to the aerodrome, C-42's aerodrome. And with that, if you have any questions, I will open up the floor.